The champagne glass trembled in my hand as Alistair Thorne's voice echoed through the mountain resort's grand ballroom, his words cutting through the elegant orchestral music like shards of ice. I sat in the shadows near the back, my silver evening gown catching the chandelier's light in ways that felt like a mockery of celebration. Around me, 300 guests laughed at his joke about stability, about how my little sister Lydia had finally found it with his son Marcus, something that certain family members could never provide. The laughter rippled through the crowd like a wave. I couldn't stop, and I felt my jaw tighten until my teeth ached. I had been 17 when the mine collapsed. 20 years ago, almost to the day, and I could still smell the acrid smoke, still hear the desperate wail of emergency sirens cutting through the mountain air. I had stood behind the cold chain-link fence that surrounded Thorne Mining's Rocky Ridge operation, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the metal that they went numb, watching as rescue crews worked frantically to reach the 37 miners trapped below. My parents were among them. The official report, released 3 weeks later in a press conference held in this very resort, had called it a natural disaster, an unfortunate consequence of unpredictable geological conditions. I had been too young, too grief-stricken, too powerless to question it then, but I wasn't that girl anymore. 2 years after the collapse, when Lydia was only 7 and I had become her sole guardian at 19, I had broken into the administrative offices of the shuttered mine. I had been working as a junior engineering assistant by then, learning the language of load-bearing structures and safety protocols, and something about the official story had never sat right with me. The building had been abandoned, papers scattered across desks as if everyone had fled in a hurry. It took me 4 hours of searching before I found it, buried in a file cabinet marked miscellaneous, a memo dated 6 months before the collapse. The words were burned into my memory, each letter a scar that never healed. Approved cost reduction measures, Section 7. Column support reinforcement postponed indefinitely. Signed A. Thorne. I had stood in that dusty office, the paper shaking in my hands, and made a promise to the ghosts of 37 miners. I would find the truth. I would make sure the world knew. And I would make Alistair Thorne pay for choosing profit over lives. The years that followed were a study in duality. By day, I became one of the most meticulous structural engineers in the state, specializing in bridge construction, obsessed with safety margins and redundancy systems. I checked and rechecked every calculation, insisted on overbuilding rather than cutting corners, and earned a reputation for being difficult but brilliant. By night, I transformed into something else entirely. A hunter gathering evidence piece by patient piece. I filed Freedom of Information requests, cross-referenced financial records, built relationships with former Thorne Mining employees who had been silenced by non-disclosure agreements and fear. I learned how to read between the lines of corporate reports, how to trace money through shell companies, how to recognize the patterns of systematic negligence dressed up as acceptable risk. And through it all, I raised Lydia. I made sure she never knew the darkness that consumed my nights, never understood why I sometimes woke screaming from dreams of collapsing tunnels and her innocent face trapped in the rubble. She grew up believing in fairy tales and happy endings, in the fundamental goodness of people, and I protected that innocence with everything I had. It was the one pure thing I could give her, the childhood I had lost. When she called me 6 months ago, her voice bubbling with joy, announcing her engagement to Marcus Thorne, I had felt my entire world fracture. I was in my apartment, surrounded by boxes of evidence I had been organizing, and I dropped the phone. It clattered on the hardwood floor, and I heard her confused hello, hello, as if from very far away. The enemy had walked into my family, wrapped himself in my sister's love, and I had no idea how to stop it without destroying her. The Thorne estate sat on 200 acres of pristine mountain land, a monument to old money and unchecked power. When I arrived for the first family dinner, Marcus greeted me at the door with genuine warmth, his eyes kind in ways that made me want to believe he was different from his father. He led me through hallways lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, each one seeming to judge my presence there. The dining room was vast, with a table that could seat 20, but that night, it was just the 4 of us, an intimate gathering that felt more like an interrogation. Alistair Thorne, in person, was different from the figure I had studied in photographs and news clippings. He was 72 but moved with the confidence of a much younger man, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit custom-tailored to hide the slight paunch of wealth and indulgence. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm to the point of being aggressive, and his smile never reached his eyes. "A structural engineer," he said, as if tasting the words. "How fascinating. So you spend your days making sure things don't fall down?" "I make sure they're built correctly from the start," I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It's much harder to fix something after it collapses." His smile tightened. "Indeed, though sometimes collapse is inevitable, despite everyone's best efforts." Across the table, Lydia and Marcus chatted about wedding plans, oblivious to the undercurrent of hostility. I forced myself to eat the perfectly prepared salmon, to sip the expensive wine, to nod at appropriate moments. But my attention kept drifting to the massive portrait hanging behind Alistair's seat, a family photo taken decades ago. Alistair stood with his late wife and young Marcus in front of a mountain vista, and I recognized the distinctive peak immediately. It was Rocky Ridge, the site of the mine, photographed from the exact angle that made the Thorn Mining corporate logo visible on the facility below. It was a statement, a claim of ownership not just of land but of lives. After dinner, Marcus offered to give me a tour of the grounds. We walked through moonlit gardens, and he talked about his work at Thorn Industries, the non-mining arm of the family business. He was passionate about renewable energy, about making amends for past environmental damage, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. When we passed a small cemetery tucked behind a hedge, markers for family pets and beloved horses, he stopped. "My father is a complicated man," he said quietly. "He comes from a generation that sees business differently, but I'm trying to change things, to build something better." "You can't build anything lasting on a rotten foundation," I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended. "Eventually, it all comes down." He looked at me curiously, and I saw him struggling with something unspoken. "Cassie, has my family done something to hurt yours? Lydia mentioned your parents died in a mining accident, but she didn't know the details." I wanted to tell him everything in that moment. I wanted to show him the memo with his father's signature, the financial records I had pieced together, the testimonies I had collected from survivors who still woke up screaming. But I looked at his earnest face, at the way he held himself like someone who genuinely believed he could fix the world, and I realized he was a victim too. He had been raised on lies, taught to see his father's empire as something noble, rather than something built on graves. "No," I lied. "Just old grief. Pay no attention to me." But I did pay attention, more than ever. I intensified my investigation, working late into the nights after site inspections, following digital trails across international banking systems. And then, 3 months before the wedding, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in the labyrinth of Thorn Industries' subsidiary companies was a new mining operation proposal, filed under the name Rocky Ridge Expansion Project. The geological surveys were identical to those from 20 years ago, the same unstable granite formations, the same water table issues. And buried in the technical specifications, I found notes in a familiar pattern. Approved load compromise. Reinforcement postponed. Signed A. Thorn. He was going to do it again. I sat in my apartment at 3 a.m, staring at the documents spread across my dining table, and felt rage unlike anything I had known. It wasn't just about my parents anymore. It was about the future victims, the families that would be destroyed, the lives that would be sacrificed for quarterly earnings reports. And this time, I had the knowledge, the evidence, and the connections to stop it. I reached out to Gabriel Reyes, an investigative journalist I had been feeding information to for the past year. We had never met in person, communicating only through encrypted channels, and he had been building his own case against Thorn Industries for labor violations and environmental crimes. When I sent him the expansion project files, his response came within an hour. "If this is real, this is murder for hire. Can you verify the signatures?" I could. I had spent years studying Alistair Thorn's handwriting, the distinctive way he formed his capital A, the impatient slash of his T. And more importantly, I had access to something Gabriel didn't. Through Marcus, I could get inside the Thorn estate, into Alistair's private office where he kept his personal files. It would be risky, possibly illegal, but the alternative was unthinkable. The opportunity came 2 weeks before the wedding, when Lydia asked me to help her choose wedding favors from samples that had been delivered to the estate. Alistair was away on business, and Marcus was at the company headquarters in the city. The house was nearly empty, just household staff who paid little attention to the bride's sister wandering the halls. While Lydia debated between silver picture frames and engraved wine stoppers in the sunroom, I excused myself to use the restroom and made my way to the 3rd floor. Alistair's office was exactly what I expected, all dark wood and leather, walls lined with hunting trophies and framed awards from mining industry organizations. His desk was immaculate, not a paper out of place, but I had learned that men like him kept their real secrets hidden. I had 20 minutes, maybe less. I went to the antique filing cabinet behind his desk and started with the bottom drawer, working my way up. Corporate records, property deeds, stock certificates, nothing I didn't already have. Then, in the top drawer, I found a folder marked Personal, and inside were documents that made my hands shake. They were authorization forms for financial transactions, millions of dollars moving through offshore accounts, and they bore signatures I recognized: Marcus Thorn, Lydia Vance. Both forged, both used to create a paper trail that would implicate them in Alistair's schemes, if anything ever went wrong. He was setting up his own son as a fall guy, and he was dragging my sister down with him. I photographed everything with my phone, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. As I was replacing the folder, I noticed something else, a small leather journal tucked behind the hanging files. I pulled it out and flipped through pages of handwritten notes, A personal log of decisions made and problems solved. And there, on a page dated 6 months before the Rocky Ridge collapse, I found the words that confirmed everything I had suspected. Board pressuring for profit increase. Old-timers complaining about safety again. Told Hendricks to approve the cuts. If something happens, it's an act of God. Nobody can prove otherwise. I photographed that too, then carefully replaced everything exactly as I had found it. When I returned to the sunroom, Lydia looked up with a smile, holding up 2 different samples. Which do you like better? I'm leaning toward the frames. The frames are perfect, I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system. They'll help people remember this day forever. That night, I sent everything to Gabriel. His response came at dawn. This changes everything. We need to coordinate the release. The wedding would be national news anyway, but this will bring down an empire. When do you want to do this? I thought about Lydia's face, her happiness, the life she had planned. I thought about Marcus, who had been kind to me, who genuinely seemed to love my sister. And then I thought about my parents, about the 37 miners who never came home, about the future workers who would die if Alistair's new project went forward. There was only one answer. The wedding, I typed back. Maximum visibility. Make sure the SEC and FBI have everything beforehand so they can move immediately. I want him arrested before the champagne goes flat. The week before the wedding was a special kind of torture. Lydia was radiant, glowing with excitement, and every time she hugged me or thanked me for being there for her, I felt the weight of what was coming. She sensed something was wrong, asking me repeatedly if I was okay, if I was happy for her. I lied every time, assuring her I was just emotional about my baby sister getting married, that these were tears of joy. Marcus pulled me aside 3 days before the ceremony, concern evident in his expression. Cassie, my father has been acting strange. He keeps making comments about you, asking questions about your work, your finances. Has he said something to you? What kind of questions? I asked, my guard immediately up. He wanted to know if you had ever worked with mining companies, if you had any history with the industry beyond your parents' accident. I told him to leave it alone, that it was none of his business, but he seemed obsessed with finding something. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I know he can be difficult. I'm sorry if he's made you uncomfortable. Don't apologize for him, I said. You're not responsible for your father's actions. But the warning made me nervous. If Alistair was digging into my background, he might discover the connections I had been building, the evidence I had been gathering. I called Gabriel and moved up our timeline. The wedding was in 3 days, and we couldn't risk Alistair finding out and disappearing. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I stood on the balcony of my hotel room, looking out at the mountain resort, where tomorrow I would destroy my sister's happiness in order to serve a greater justice. The mathematics of it were brutal. One person's joy measured against dozens of lives, corporate corruption measured against family loyalty. In any equation, the answer was clear, but that didn't make it hurt less. My phone buzzed with a message from Lydia. Can't sleep. Too excited. Thank you for everything, Cassie. I know I was only 7 when Mom and Dad died, but I remember how you held me at the funeral, how you promised nothing would ever hurt me again. You kept that promise. I love you. I closed my eyes and let the mountain wind dry the tears on my cheeks. The irony was crushing. I had kept her safe from poverty, from loneliness, from the nightmares that plagued me. But I couldn't keep her safe from the truth, and the truth was going to devastate her. At midnight, I received confirmation from Gabriel. Everything is in place. The SEC has the documents. FBI will be standing by. The story goes live the moment you give the signal. Are you sure about this? I typed back, I've been sure for 20 years. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, crisp mountain air, and brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered peaks glow. The resort had been transformed into a winter wonderland, white roses and silver ribbons everywhere, ice sculptures catching the light like frozen diamonds. Lydia looked breathtaking in her gown, her happiness so pure it hurt to look at directly. When she asked me to help her get ready, I braided baby's breath into her hair with steady hands, the same hands that would pull the trigger on her world in just a few hours. I wish Mom and Dad could see this, she said softly, meeting my eyes in the mirror. They would be so proud of you, I said, and meant it. They would want you to be happy. Are you happy, Cassie? Really? You work so hard you never date? You spend all your time on those projects. When do you get to have what you want? Today is about you, I deflected. My turn will come. The ceremony was beautiful. Marcus's vows sincere and heartfelt. Lydia's response making half the guests tear up. I stood beside her as maid of honor, holding her bouquet, watching her marry into the family that had killed our parents, and felt my resolve harden into something unbreakable. This was necessary. This was right. This was justice. The reception was held in the grand ballroom, a space that could hold 500 but felt intimate despite the crowd. I had positioned myself strategically at a table near the back, with clear sightlines to both the head table and the main entrance. Gabriel had texted me that federal agents were in position outside, waiting for my signal. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Alistair would give his toast, I would respond with my own carefully crafted words that would seem like normal family emotion to most listeners, but would be the trigger phrase Gabriel was waiting for. And then the evidence would go live on every major news outlet simultaneously. The dinner passed in a blur of forced smiles and small talk. I barely tasted the food, my attention fixed on Alistair at the head table, holding court like the king he imagined himself to be. He radiated confidence, secure in his power, unaware that his empire was about to crumble. At precisely 1:45, he stood, crystal champagne flute in hand, and the room fell silent. His speech was everything I expected, funny and self-deprecating in ways that made people like him, full of advice about marriage and partnership that rang hollow when I thought about the journal entries I had read. And then he got to the part I had been waiting for. Lydia is a special young woman, someone who has overcome adversity with grace and strength. She's finally found the stability that, tragically, some members of her family were never able to provide. The room chuckled, thinking he was making a gentle joke about my single status, about my workaholic tendencies. But I saw the glint in his eye, the deliberate malice in the timing. He knew exactly what he was doing. I stood, and the silver gown I had chosen specifically for this moment caught the chandelier light, making me visible to everyone in the room. The fabric had cost more than I usually spent on clothes in a year, but it was armor, a statement that I belonged here, that I had every right to challenge him. Mr. Thorne, my voice carried across the room, trained by years of presenting engineering reports to hostile clients. You speak of stability, but do you understand what truly keeps ground stable? What prevents collapse? His smile faltered slightly, confusion crossing his features. Around us, guests began to murmur, unsure if this was part of the planned entertainment. It's the integrity of the foundation. I continued, walking toward the head table, each step deliberate. Cut corners on the support structure, ignore safety protocols, prioritize profit over people, and eventually, inevitably, everything comes crashing down. Miss Vance. Alistair's voice had an edge now, though he maintained his smile. This is hardly the time for an engineering lecture. You're right. This is the time for truth. I reached the head table and turned to face the room, 300 pairs of eyes on me. 20 years ago, 37 miners died at Rocky Ridge when Thorne Mining's operation collapsed. My parents were among them. The official report called it a natural disaster, but it wasn't. It was negligence. It was cost-cutting. It was one man deciding that reinforcement supports were too expensive and that human lives were an acceptable business risk. The room erupted. Lydia's face went white. Marcus stood up so fast his chair fell over, and Alistair's mask of geniality finally cracked, revealing the cold fury beneath. You have no proof of such slanderous accusations, he hissed. Actually, I do. I pulled my phone from the small clutch I'd been carrying and held it up. I have internal memos with your signature approving cost reductions. I have financial records showing $3.2 million diverted from safety funds to offshore accounts. I have your personal journal where you wrote, and I quote, "If something happens, it's an act of God. Nobody can prove otherwise." I paused, looking directly at him. But the most interesting thing I found was the Rocky Ridge expansion project, where you're planning to do exactly the same thing again. New mine, same dangerous cost-cutting, same disregard for human life. Alistair's phone, sitting on the table beside his champagne flute, suddenly lit up with notification after notification. I saw his face go from red to white as he picked it up, his hands shaking slightly as he read. Around the room, other phones began to buzz and chime, guests checking devices to see what was happening. What have you done? Alistair's voice was barely a whisper. I've made sure the truth sees daylight. I replied. The Securities and Exchange Commission received everything this morning. So did the FBI. And as of 90 seconds ago, when I said the words integrity of the foundation, major news outlets nationwide received packets with all the evidence, including documents showing how you forged Marcus and Lydia's signatures to cover your illegal financial transactions. Marcus grabbed his own phone, staring at the screen in disbelief. She's telling the truth. Dad, there are warrants, federal warrants with your name on them, and mine, and Lydia's. What did you do? I built an empire, Alistair roared, his composure completely shattered. I made this family wealthy beyond measure. Every decision I made was for us, for our future. You killed 37 people, I said, and my voice broke despite my best efforts to stay controlled. You killed my mother and father because you wanted slightly better quarterly earnings. And you were going to do it again because you've never faced consequences, never been held accountable. That ends today. Lydia was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she stared at me with an expression of betrayal so complete it was physically painful to witness. Marcus had his arm around her, but he was looking at his father with dawning horror, clearly processing the implications of forged signatures and federal investigations. The main doors of the ballroom burst open, and federal agents in dark suits flooded in, moving with the kind of purposeful efficiency that left no doubt this was real. The lead agent approached Alistair, badge held high. "Alistair Thorne, you're under arrest for wire fraud, reckless endangerment, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder through criminal negligence." As they read him his rights and placed him in handcuffs, champagne from his dropped glass spreading across the white tablecloth like blood, the ballroom descended into chaos. Guests were shouting, trying to leave, taking photos and videos. The wedding had become a crime scene, and I had made it happen. I walked over to Lydia, who shrank back from me as if I were toxic. "Lydia, I'm so sorry it had to be this way." "Get away from me," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "You destroyed everything. My wedding day, my marriage, my husband's family. How could you?" "Because it was the truth," I said, feeling something break inside me. "Because if I didn't stop it, more people would die, including possibly you and Marcus, left holding the bag for his crimes." Marcus was staring at his phone, reading through articles that were now flooding the internet. "She saved us," he said quietly. "Lydia, look. My father used our identities to create shell companies. If this had continued, we would have gone to prison too. She exposed it before we were completely implicated." "I don't care," Lydia screamed, finally losing her composure completely. "She could have told us privately. She could have warned us. Instead, she turned my wedding into a spectacle, humiliated us in front of everyone we know, and sent Marcus's father to prison. How is that saving us?" I had no answer that would satisfy her. The mathematics had been clear. The only way to ensure Alistair couldn't escape or destroy evidence was to move quickly and publicly. But explaining that to my sobbing sister in her ruined wedding dress seemed impossible. "Go," Marcus said to me, not unkindly. "Just go. We need time to process this." I left the ballroom, walked past gawking guests and busy federal agents, and made it to my hotel room before the shaking started. I had done it. I had brought down Alistair Thorne, exposed his crimes, prevented future deaths, and avenged my parents. I had also destroyed my relationship with the only family I had left, ruined my sister's wedding day, and ensured that I would forever be the villain in her story. In the bathroom, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. Silver dress still perfect, makeup still intact, looking exactly like someone who belonged at a fancy wedding. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She had the face of a crusader, a warrior, someone who had sacrificed everything for a greater good. But she also looked utterly, devastatingly alone. My phone rang. "Gabriel Reyes. You did it. The story is everywhere. FBI is confirming multiple warrants. SEC is launching a full investigation. And mining safety advocates are calling this the biggest breakthrough in holding corporate executives accountable in decades. Cassie, you changed history today." "I ruined my sister's life," I replied, my voice hollow. "You saved your sister's life," Gabriel corrected. "She just doesn't know it yet. Give her time." But time felt like something I no longer had any claim to. That night, while the rest of the resort buzzed with gossip and speculation, I sat alone in my room and wrote Lydia a letter I knew she probably wouldn't read. I explained everything: the years of investigation, the evidence I had found, the impossible choice between her happiness and justice for 37 families. I told her about finding her and Marcus's forged signatures, about the expansion project that would have killed more miners, about how staying silent would have made me complicit in future deaths. I told her I loved her, that I had always loved her, and that I understood if she never forgave me. I slipped it under her hotel room door at 3 a.m, then drove home, leaving the mountain resort and my sister's shattered wedding behind. The weeks that followed were a media frenzy. Alistair Thorne's arrest became national news, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk about corporate accountability and mining safety regulations. I was contacted by dozens of reporters, but I referred them all to Gabriel, who had earned the exclusive. I didn't want to be the face of this story. I just wanted it to be over. The investigation moved quickly. With the evidence I had provided, prosecutors built an overwhelming case. Alistair Thorne was denied bail, deemed a flight risk given his offshore accounts and international connections. The charges expanded as investigators dug deeper, finding years of violations, bribes paid to inspectors, falsified safety reports, and a pattern of negligence that went far beyond Rocky Ridge. Marcus and Lydia were cleared of any wrongdoing, their forged signatures recognized as the fraud they were. Marcus immediately resigned from Thorne Industries and released a public statement condemning his father's actions and pledging to cooperate fully with investigators. Reading his words, I felt a complicated mix of respect and sorrow. He was a good man trapped in a bad legacy, and I had been the one to blow up his world. Lydia didn't contact me. Days became weeks, and my calls went to voicemail, my texts unanswered. I understood her anger, even expected it, but the silence was harder than I had anticipated. I threw myself into work, took on extra projects, Anything to avoid thinking about the chasm that had opened between us. 2 months after the wedding that never was, I received a visitor at my office. Marcus Thorne stood in my doorway, looking older than he had at the resort, the weight of scandal and family shame evident in the set of his shoulders. "Can I come in?" he asked. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, my heart pounding. "How is she?" "Angry, hurt, confused." Marcus sat down heavily. "But she's starting to understand. The prosecutors showed us everything, the full scope of what my father did. The families of the Rocky Ridge victims, they reached out to her, thanked her for finally getting justice for their loved ones. It's been overwhelming. I never wanted to hurt her," I said, "and it came out more defensively than I intended." "I know." Marcus met my eyes, and I saw something there I hadn't expected. "Gratitude. You saved my life, Cassie. If you had waited even a few more weeks, I would have been fully implicated. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, everything was set up to make it look like I was involved. My father was planning to retire and leave me holding all the legal liability." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made my chest tight. "I'm sorry you had to find out about him this way." "There's no good way to find out your father is a monster," Marcus said quietly, "but better now than after more people died. The expansion project, the one you exposed, it would have been operational in 6 months. The geological surveys you found were even worse than the ones from Rocky Ridge. If it had collapsed, it would have killed over 50 workers. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just avenge your parents. You saved lives that haven't even been put at risk yet." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what might have been hanging between us. "Lydia asked me to give you something," Marcus finally said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "She's not ready to see you yet, but she wanted you to have this." After he left, I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single piece of paper, covered in Lydia's familiar handwriting. "Cassie, I don't know when I'll be able to talk to you again. Every time I think about the wedding, I feel sick and angry and confused. You turned the happiest day of my life into a nightmare, and part of me wants to hate you for that. But then I think about Mom and Dad, about the families who lost loved ones at Rocky Ridge, about the workers who would have died in the new mine. And I realize that if you had asked me privately what to do, if you had given me a choice between my wedding and 50 human lives, I would have made the same decision you did. I'm furious with you for not trusting me enough to include me, but I'm also starting to understand that you were protecting me one last time, taking on the role of villain so I could stay innocent. I'm not ready to forgive you yet. Maybe I never will be, but I want you to know that I'm trying to understand." And Marcus showed me the document about the forged signatures. "Thank you for exposing that before we ended up in prison for his father's crimes. You didn't just destroy my wedding. You gave me a chance at a real future, one built on truth instead of lies. I need time, but I do love you. I always will. Lydia." I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words, before carefully folding it and putting it in my desk drawer. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. It was a first step toward healing the rift between us. 3 months later, Gabriel called me with news that made my hands shake. The trust fund set up for Rocky Ridge victims' families, which had been tied up in legal disputes for 20 years, had finally been released. Moreover, the court had ordered Thorne Industries to establish a compensation fund of $50 million to be distributed to the families and to support mining safety initiatives. And they wanted to name it the Vance Memorial Fund, after my parents. "They want you at the ceremony," Gabriel said. "All the families will be there. It's going to be a big moment." The ceremony took place at the old Rocky Ridge mine site, which had been purchased by a conservation group and was being converted into a memorial park. Standing on the ground where my parents had died, looking at the mountain that had been both tomb and testament, I felt something shift inside me. The obsession that had driven me for 20 years, the anger and grief that had shaped every decision, began to transform into something else. Not peace exactly, but purpose. The memorial was simple: a black granite wall with the names of all 37 miners engraved in gold. Below their names, a plaque read, "In memory of those who died because safety was treated as negotiable. May their sacrifice ensure it never happens again. Built on truth, standing for justice." The Vance Memorial Fund. Families I had been investigating alongside for years, people who had become allies and friends in the shared search for accountability, came up to hug me and thank me. Children who had been orphaned like Lydia and me, now grown with families of their own, told me how much it meant to finally have validation, to know that their parents' deaths hadn't been forgotten or dismissed. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd of 200 people, families of victims, mining safety advocates, journalists, and scattered among them, the faces I had been hoping to see. Lydia and Marcus, standing at the back, her hand in his. "My father used to say that engineering was about making things that lasted," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside me. He believed that every structure we build, every bridge and building and tunnel, is a promise to the future. A promise that we did our best, that we didn't cut corners, that we valued human life above all else. 20 years ago, that promise was broken. 37 people died because someone decided profit mattered more than safety. For 20 years, I have worked to make sure that the truth about their deaths became known, that the lies and cover-ups were exposed, and that it would never happen again. I paused, gathering my thoughts. I won't pretend this journey has been easy, or that justice came without cost. It required sacrifice, difficult choices, and accepting that sometimes doing the right thing means losing people you love, at least temporarily. But standing here today, seeing this memorial, knowing that the Vance Memorial Fund will help prevent future tragedies, I believe it was worth it. My parents didn't die in vain. Their deaths, and the deaths of all 37 miners, have meaning now. They've changed laws, changed safety standards, and changed how we hold corporations accountable. That's their legacy, and it's a legacy built on truth. As I stepped down from the podium, Lydia appeared beside me. We stood there for a long moment, not touching, not speaking, just existing in the same space for the first time in months. Then she reached out and took my hand, her grip tight and trembling. "I'm still angry," she whispered, "but I'm also proud. And I miss you." "I miss you too," I managed to say, my throat constricting. "I'm so sorry, Lydia. I'm sorry I couldn't find another way." "There wasn't another way," she said, and I heard the resignation in her voice, the acceptance that had come through months of processing and therapy and long conversations with Marcus. "I've read everything now, all the evidence, all the testimony. If you had warned me, I might have tried to stop you. I might have chosen him over justice because I loved him, because I was naive. You protected me from making that mistake." Marcus joined us, his expression solemn but kind. "My father pled guilty 2 days ago," he said quietly. "He's going to prison for 15 years, minimum. And Thorn Industries is being dismantled, assets sold to pay restitution and fines. It's over, Cassie. You won." But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving, like finally being able to breathe after holding my breath for 2 decades, like the end of one story and the uncertain beginning of another. Over the following months, Lydia and I began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship. We met for coffee once a week, conversations that were stilted and careful at first, avoiding the elephant in the room, talking about work and weather and anything safe. But gradually, we found our way back to each other, not as the sisters we had been, but as something new, something forged through fire and hardship. She told me about the therapy she and Marcus had been attending, both individual and couples counseling, working through the trauma of everything that had happened. They had postponed the wedding indefinitely, needing time to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than illusion. Marcus was working with a small renewable energy startup now, deliberately choosing a path far removed from his father's empire. I told her about the nightmares that had finally stopped, about how for the first time since I was 17, I could sleep through the night without seeing the mine collapse in my dreams. About how I had started taking weekends off, learning to separate my identity from my crusade, discovering who Cassie Vance was when she wasn't hunting justice. 6 months after the memorial dedication, Lydia called me with news that made my heart swell. She was pregnant. She and Marcus had decided to move forward with their life together, wedding or no wedding, ready to start a family built on truth and transparency. "There's something else," she said, her voice soft and emotional. "If it's a girl, we want to name her Clara, after Mom. We want her to know where she comes from, what her grandmother stood for. And we want her to understand what it means to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. We want her to know about you." I couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Lydia, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll be in her life," Lydia replied. "Say you'll be the aunt who teaches her to be strong and brave and to stand up for truth, no matter the cost. Say you'll help us give her a foundation that's solid and real. Always," I promised. "I will always be there for her. And for you." The following spring, Clara Vance Thorn was born, a healthy baby girl with her mother's eyes and her father's nose, and a cry that could shake the rafters. When Lydia placed her in my arms for the first time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure, uncomplicated joy. This tiny human represented everything I had fought for: a future unmarred by the sins of previous generations, a life that would be built on honesty and safety and love. As I held her, Marcus came over and put his hand on my shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving us the chance at this, for making sure our children would grow up with a father who isn't in prison, in a family that isn't built on lies." A year later, I returned to Rocky Ridge for the official opening of the memorial park. The abandoned mine site had been transformed into a beautiful space, with walking trails and informational plaques about mining history and safety. The centerpiece was the memorial wall, which had been expanded to include not just the names of the Rocky Ridge victims, but space for all mining disaster victims across the country. It had become a national landmark, a place where families could come to remember and where students could learn about the importance of workplace safety. I brought Clara with me, carrying her in a sling against my chest as I walked the trails with Lydia and Marcus. We stopped at the memorial wall, and I traced my fingers over my parents' names, carved forever into black granite. "Mom, Dad," I said softly, aware that Lydia was crying beside me. "I want you to meet your granddaughter, Clara. She's going to grow up knowing your story, knowing what you stood for. And she's going to grow up in a world that's a little bit safer because of what happened here. Because I didn't let your deaths be meaningless. Because I made sure the truth came out no matter what it cost." Lydia squeezed my hand, and I felt the last fragments of the wall between us crumble away. We had both lost so much: our parents, our innocence, years of our relationship to anger and misunderstanding. But we had also gained something precious: the knowledge that justice matters, that truth is worth fighting for, and that family, real family, can survive even the most devastating revelations. Gabriel came to the dedication ceremony, presenting me with a bound copy of all the articles he had written about the case. "It's called Legacy of Collapse," he said, showing me the cover. "The story of how one engineer took down a corrupt empire. But it's also about more than that. It's about the price of justice and the courage it takes to stand up to power." I thumbed through the pages, seeing my life laid out in newsprint, quotes from victims' families, technical explanations of the evidence I had gathered, photographs of the arrest and the trial. It was strange seeing my story from the outside, understanding how it had resonated with people across the country, how it had sparked a national conversation about corporate accountability and workplace safety. "You became a symbol," Gabriel said, "not just for mining safety advocates, but for anyone who has ever had to choose between loyalty and justice, between protecting family and exposing truth. People write to me every week asking about you, sharing their own stories of standing up to corruption, of choosing the hard right over the easy wrong." "I'm not a hero," I said, uncomfortable with the narrative he was describing. "I'm just someone who couldn't live with injustice, who couldn't let my parents' deaths be swept under the rug." "That's exactly what makes you a hero," Gabriel replied. "Heroes are just ordinary people who refuse to accept that things have to stay broken." As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the memorial park, I stood with my sister and her family, with Gabriel and the other families who had fought alongside me, and I felt something I had thought was lost forever. Hope. Not the naive hope of childhood, but the hard-won hope of someone who has stared into darkness and chosen to light a candle anyway. The years that followed brought their own challenges and triumphs. Alistair Thorne's trial became a landmark case, setting precedents for holding corporate executives criminally liable for safety violations. The testimony I provided, the evidence I had gathered, became the foundation for new legislation, strengthening workplace safety regulations, and increasing penalties for violations. Mining companies across the country overhauled their safety protocols, terrified of becoming the next Thorne Industries. Marcus and Lydia eventually did have a wedding, a small, intimate ceremony in the memorial park, surrounded by family and friends who understood the journey they had taken to get there. I stood beside my sister as her maid of honor once again, but this time there were no hidden agendas, no secrets waiting to explode. Just two people who had looked at the worst of their family's legacies and chosen to build something better. Clara grew into a curious, fearless toddler, asking endless questions about everything she saw. On her 3rd birthday, Lydia gave her a small yellow hard hat, sized for a child, with "Safety First" printed on the side. "This was your grandfather's," she explained, showing Clara the photo of my father wearing an identical hat. "He believed that everyone deserves to come home safe from work. Aunt Cassie made sure people remember that." I watched Clara put on the hard hat, walking around with the serious expression children get when they're wearing something important, and I felt the final piece of healing click into place. This was why I had done it. Not for revenge, though that had been part of it in the beginning. Not for justice alone, though that was crucial. But for this, for the next generation, for a future where children grew up knowing that their safety mattered more than corporate profits, where truth was valued over convenience. On the 20th anniversary of the Memorial Park's dedication, I was invited to give a keynote speech at a national conference on workplace safety. Standing before an audience of engineers, safety inspectors, legislators, and labor advocates, I looked out at faces young and old, people who had been inspired by the Rocky Ridge case to pursue careers in safety and accountability. 20 years ago, I made a choice that cost me dearly. I began. I chose justice over family harmony, truth over comfortable lies, the long, hard road over the easy path. And I won't lie to you, there were many times I questioned that choice. Many nights I lay awake wondering if I had destroyed more than I had built. But standing here today, seeing the changes that have happened, the lives that have been saved, the culture shift in how we approach workplace safety, I know it was the right choice. I paused, gathering my thoughts. But I also want to be honest about the cost. My sister and I lost years of our relationship. I became so consumed with my crusade that I forgot how to live, forgot that justice without compassion is just another form of cruelty. I thought I was building something, but for a long time, all I was doing was tearing down. It took me years to understand that real change, lasting change, requires both demolition and construction. You have to clear away the rot, yes, but then you have to build something better in its place. I clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of the memorial park, children playing on the grass while their parents read the informational plaques. This is what we built from the rubble, not just a memorial to the dead, but a living reminder to the living. Not just punishment for past crimes, but prevention of future ones. That's the real legacy, not the collapse, but what we choose to build afterward. After the speech, a young woman approached me, maybe 25, with an engineering degree from a prestigious university and eyes that reminded me of my own at that age, hungry and determined. Miss Vance, I just wanted to thank you. My father died in a construction accident when I was 8. OSHA found 17 violations at the site, but the company paid a fine and nothing else happened. Nobody went to prison. Nobody lost their license. I became an engineer because of your story, because you showed me that one person with enough determination and evidence can take down an entire corrupt system. I want to do what you did. I looked at her earnest face and felt a complicated mix of pride and concern. Then let me give you some advice, I said. Don't let the pursuit of justice consume you the way it consumed me. Yes, fight for what's right. Yes, gather your evidence and expose corruption. But don't forget to live while you're doing it. Don't sacrifice every relationship, every moment of happiness, every piece of yourself on the altar of accountability. Justice is important, but so is mercy, especially mercy for yourself. She nodded, processing this, and I saw in her expression the same stubborn determination I had carried for decades. She would learn her own lessons, make her own mistakes, find her own balance between crusade and life. But maybe, just maybe, she would do it a little bit wiser than I had. That night, I had dinner with Lydia, Marcus, and 6-year-old Clara at their home, a comfortable house in a quiet suburb, deliberately modest, deliberately normal. Clara insisted on showing me her latest school project, a poster about important women in history. She had chosen to do hers on me. Aunt Cassie is a hero, she explained seriously, pointing to the magazine cutout photo she had used, taken at the memorial dedication. She made sure people are safe at work. And she never gave up, even when it was hard. Being a hero is complicated, sweetheart, I said, pulling her onto my lap. Sometimes you have to make choices that hurt people you love. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good at all. Your Aunt Cassie made a lot of mistakes along the way. But you also saved a lot of people, Clara countered with the absolute certainty of childhood. Mommy says that when you see something wrong, you have to speak up, even if people get mad at you. That's what you did. I looked at Lydia over Clara's head, and she smiled, a smile that held 20 years of pain and healing, anger and forgiveness, loss and rediscovery. We had both changed so much from the terrified orphans we had been, but we had found our way back to each other, and that was its own kind of justice. Later, after Clara had gone to bed and Marcus had retreated to his study, Lydia and I sat on the porch with glasses of wine, watching fireflies dance in the summer darkness. Do you ever regret it? She asked, not for the first time. Everything that happened? I considered the question seriously, as I always did. I regret the pain it caused you. I regret that I couldn't find a way to bring down Alistair without ruining your wedding day. I regret the years we lost being angry at each other. But do I regret exposing the truth? No. I couldn't live with myself if I had stayed silent, and more people had died. I know, Lydia said softly. I understand that now. It took me a long time, but I finally understand that you didn't destroy my happiness. You gave me the foundation to build real happiness, the kind that doesn't collapse when you discover it was based on lies. We sat in comfortable silence, sisters who had walked through fire and emerged scarred but stronger. The foundation of our relationship had cracked and crumbled, but we had rebuilt it, and this time it was solid, constructed from honesty and hard-won understanding rather than the naive love of childhood. Clara asked me last week why Grandpa Thorne is in prison, Lydia said eventually. I didn't know how to explain it in a way she could understand. What did you tell her? The truth, Lydia replied, that he made bad choices, that he hurt people because he cared more about money than safety, and that actions have consequences. And that her Aunt Cassie made sure those consequences happened, even though it was really hard. She paused. She asked if that made you a good guy or a bad guy. I told her you were both. That real people are complicated, that sometimes you have to hurt people you love to stop something terrible, and that being a hero doesn't mean being perfect. That's a lot of complexity for a 6-year-old, I observed. She's a smart kid, Lydia said with a mother's pride. And I want her to grow up understanding that the world isn't simple. That right and wrong aren't always clear-cut, but that you still have to try to do what's right even when it's messy and painful. As the evening deepened, I thought about the long road that had brought me here, from the teenage girl standing behind a chain-link fence watching rescue crews fail to save her parents, to the woman sitting on this porch, holding the pieces of a life hard-won and honestly lived. The obsession that had driven me for so many years had finally released its grip. Not because I had achieved perfect justice, there was no such thing, but because I had done everything I could, and that had to be enough. The memorial park stood as a testament to what I had accomplished, but this moment, sitting with my sister in the firefly dance darkness, her child sleeping safely upstairs, her husband working on legitimate business in his study, that was the real victory. Not the empire I had toppled or the criminal I had brought to justice, but the family I had saved, including my own. As I drove home that night, I passed the sign for the Vance Memorial Fund headquarters, established in a renovated building downtown. The fund had grown beyond my wildest expectations, supporting not just mining safety but workplace safety initiatives across all industries. We had funded research into better protective equipment, lobbied for stronger regulations, provided scholarships for students studying occupational safety, and offered support services to families affected by workplace accidents. The building's cornerstone bore an inscription I had chosen myself, words taken from my father's old notebooks. Build to last. Build to protect. Build with integrity. Simple words, but they contained everything I had learned through this journey, everything I hoped to pass on to the next generation of engineers and safety advocates. In my apartment, I had finally unpacked the last boxes from my old place, finally allowed myself to create a home rather than just a headquarters for my investigation. The walls held photos now, images of Lydia and Clara, of the memorial park, of my parents from before the tragedy, young and happy and so terribly unaware of what was coming. On my desk sat the leather-bound journal Gabriel had given me, filled with articles and testimonies and the documented story of everything we had accomplished. But next to it sat something else, a new journal, blank pages waiting to be filled. On the first page, Lydia had written a message when she had given it to me for my last birthday. For the next chapter. Write about building, not just demolishing. Write about living, not just fighting. Write about who Cassie is now, not just who she had to become. I opened to the first blank page and uncapped my pen, considering what to write. For 20 years, my story had been about revenge and justice, and bringing down a corrupt empire. But that story was over now, the final chapter written with Alistair's conviction and the establishment of the Memorial Fund. This was a new story, one I was only beginning to understand how to tell. Today I learned that victory is quieter than I expected, I wrote. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like finally being able to rest, like standing on solid ground after years of walking on fault lines, waiting for the earth to crack beneath my feet. Lydia says I'm a hero, but I think I'm just someone who refused to let injustice have the final word. Someone who understood that some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is almost unbearable. I paused, looking out my window at the city lights, thinking about all the lives that had intersected with mine over these decades, the victims and their families, the whistleblowers and investigators, the journalists and lawyers and advocates who had helped me dismantle Alistair's empire. And I thought about the people who would never know what I had prevented, the miners who had come home safe because of regulations that bore my parents' names, the families who had never experienced the grief that had shaped my entire adult life. But the real victory, I continued writing, isn't in what I destroyed. It's in what we built afterward. The memorial park where children play and families remember, the safety fund that saves lives every day. The sister relationship I thought I had broken forever, now stronger for having been tested and repaired. The next generation, represented by Clara and all the children like her, who will grow up in a world slightly safer, slightly more just, because we refuse to stay silent. I wrote late into the night, not documenting evidence or planning strategy for the first time in decades, but simply processing, reflecting, trying to understand what it all meant. The obsession that had sustained me for so long had finally burned out, leaving behind not ashes but something like peace, hard-won, and tinged with regret, but genuine nonetheless. The next morning, I woke to a text from Gabriel. SEC just announced new regulations based on the Thorn case. Mandatory independent safety audits for all extractive industries. Criminal liability for executives who knowingly approve unsafe practices. Whistleblower protection strengthened. Cassie, you changed the law. Literally changed how this country protects workers. I read the message 3 times, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. This was what I had been fighting for, not just punishment for past crimes, but prevention of future ones. Not just revenge, but reform. The foundation I had helped build would stand long after I was gone, protecting people I would never meet, saving lives that would never know they had been in danger. I forwarded the message to Lydia with a simple note. We did it. Her response came quickly. No, you did it, and we're all grateful. But she was wrong. I hadn't done it alone. Every victim's family who had trusted me with their stories, every whistleblower who had risked their career to provide evidence, every journalist who had refused to let the story die, every legislator who had listened and acted, we had all done it together. Justice wasn't a solo performance. It was a chorus, and I had simply been the one willing to start singing when everyone else was silent. Years continued to pass, marked now not by investigation milestones, but by ordinary family moments. Clara's first day of school, Lydia's successful interior design business launch, Marcus's promotion to Director of Sustainable Energy Initiatives at his new company. I dated occasionally, learning to trust people again, to let someone see the parts of me that weren't defined by my crusade. I traveled, taking vacations for the first time in decades, seeing the world beyond courtrooms and corporate offices and memorial parks. But I never forgot. On the anniversary of the Rocky Ridge collapse, I always returned to the memorial park, usually alone but sometimes with Lydia and her family. I would stand before that black granite wall, running my fingers over the names carved there, and I would remember. Not just the tragedy, but also the triumph. Not just what was lost, but what was saved. On the 25th anniversary, the memorial park held a special ceremony. The governor was there, along with labor leaders and safety advocates from across the country. They unveiled a new addition to the memorial, a bronze statue of a miner holding a safety lamp, his face lifted toward the sky with an expression of dignity and determination. At the base, a plaque read, "In honor of all who work in dangerous places, and those who fight to make those places safer." When the governor asked me to say a few words, I climbed the platform and looked out at the crowd, seeing familiar faces and new ones, old allies and young advocates who had been children when this all began. 25 years ago, I was a 17-year-old girl who had lost everything. I began, my voice steady with practice and conviction. I was angry and grieving and desperate for answers. It would have been easy to let that anger consume me, to become bitter and cynical, to accept that justice was impossible and that powerful people always escape consequences. But I had two things that kept me going: love for my sister and a promise to my parents that their deaths would mean something. I paused, seeing Lydia in the crowd, Clara now 11 years old standing beside her, and Marcus with his arm around both of them. I spent 2 decades building a case, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. And when that moment came, I didn't hesitate. I exposed Alistair Thorne's crimes in the most public way possible, and in doing so, I hurt people I loved. I destroyed my sister's wedding day. I shattered her illusions about the man she was marrying. I became the villain in her story, at least for a while. The crowd was silent, listening intently, but I also saved lives. Not just the lives of the miners who would have died in Alistair's new operation, but the countless workers who are safer today because of the reforms and regulations that came from this case. And eventually, my sister understood. She forgave me, not because what I did stopped hurting, but because she recognized that some things are more important than individual happiness. Truth, justice, safety, the common good. I looked directly at the young people in the crowd, the next generation of engineers and advocates and crusaders. If you take nothing else from this story, understand this: doing the right thing will cost you. It will cost you relationships, comfort, peace of mind. There will be nights you lie awake, wondering if you made the right choice, if the price was worth it. But if you don't act, if you stay silent in the face of injustice, that will cost you too. It will cost you your integrity, your self-respect, and possibly the lives of people who are depending on you to speak up. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, 300 people standing in the summer sunshine, remembering the dead and honoring the living who continued their work. As the crowd dispersed, Clara ran up to me, her young face serious and determined. "Aunt Cassie, I've decided," she announced. "I'm going to be a safety engineer, like you. I want to make sure people come home safe from work." I knelt down to her level, seeing so much of myself in her eyes, the determination and the idealism and the fierce sense of justice. But I also saw something I had lacked at her age: the wisdom of learning from others' experiences rather than just your own mistakes. "Then I have one piece of advice for you," I said, cupping her face in my hands. "Be passionate about the work. Fight for what's right, but don't forget to live while you're fighting. Don't sacrifice every joy, every relationship, every moment of beauty on the altar of your cause. Justice is important, but so is mercy. Remember that." She nodded solemnly, then hugged me tight. "You're the bravest person I know," she whispered. "I'm just someone who couldn't stay quiet," I replied. "That's all any of us can do. See something wrong and refuse to look away." As the sun set over the memorial park, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, I stood with Lydia, watching Clara run ahead on the trails with her friends, young and carefree in ways we had never been able to be at her age. The foundation we had built, literally and metaphorically, was solid. It would last. It would protect. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't done it?" Lydia asked, her voice quiet. "If you had just let it go, moved on, let the past stay buried?" I considered the question, as I had so many times over the years. "More people would have died," I said simply. "The expansion project would have collapsed, just like Rocky Ridge. And I would have known I could have stopped it. I could have lived with a lot of things, Lydia, but not that." She nodded, understanding in a way she couldn't have 25 years ago. I'm glad you did it, she said. Not just for the miners or for justice or any of the big reasons. I'm glad, because it taught Clara, and it will teach her children someday, that ordinary people can stand up to powerful corporations and win. That one person with enough determination and evidence can change the world. We change the world, I corrected. You, me, Marcus, Gabriel, all the families, all the advocates, no one does it alone. As darkness fell and we walked back to the parking lot, I took one last look at the memorial wall, now illuminated by soft lighting that made the gold letters glow against the black granite. 37 names. 37 lives, the foundation on which everything else had been built. Thank you, I whispered, not sure if I was talking to my parents or to some greater force of justice or simply to my younger self who had made that promise so many years ago. Thank you for giving me the strength to see it through. The drive home was peaceful, the mountain roads winding through darkness punctuated by starlight. I thought about the new journal waiting on my desk, now half filled with reflections and stories and lessons learned. I thought about the speaking engagements scheduled for next month, universities and conferences where young engineers wanted to hear about ethics and courage and the real-world cost of standing up for what you believe in. But mostly I thought about Clara, and all the children like her, growing up in a world slightly safer because we had refused to stay silent. That was the real legacy, not the collapse, but what we had built in its place. Not the empire we had torn down, but the foundation we had constructed from its rubble. Justice, I had learned, wasn't a moment. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation at the wedding or the arrest or the conviction. Justice was a process, a daily choice to keep building, keep fighting, keep believing that truth mattered more than convenience, and that human lives were worth more than corporate profits. It was exhausting and expensive and sometimes seemed impossible, but it was also essential as the support beams in a bridge, as critical as the safety measures in a mine. Without it, everything eventually collapsed. With it, structures could stand for generations, protecting the people who depended on them, fulfilling the promises made by engineers and architects, and anyone who built things meant to last. I had built something that would last, not perfectly, not without cost, but solidly, and that, finally, was enough.